Experience the intimate world of Alexander the Great, Babylon's last night, where every moment holds the weight of unspoken understanding. In this peaceful journey through time, you'll discover the quiet dignity of people living their daily lives, unaware of how their small gestures reveal the depths of human experience. The marble beneath Alexander's body held the accumulated warmth of the Babylonian day, releasing it now in gentle waves that rose with the steam from the scented water. The bath chamber existed in a perpetual state of humid tranquility, where the soft splash of water being poured from bronze vessels created a rhythm as ancient as the palace itself. Persian servants moved with the fluid grace of dancers, their movements so practiced that they seemed to be part of the chamber's natural atmosphere, like the steam that curled upward from the surface of the bath, carrying with it the fragrance of oils brought from the furthest reaches of his empire. Alexander let his eyes drift closed as warm water cascaded over his shoulders, each drop carrying away something he could not name. The servants' hands were gentle as they worked the oils into his skin, their touch impersonal yet somehow intimate, a reminder that even he, who commanded the known world, required this daily return to the most basic of human needs. The water lapped against the marble edges with a sound like whispered prayers, and in this humid sanctuary he could almost forget the weight of the diadem that would soon rest again upon his brow. He had grown thinner since the fever in India, his body no longer the instrument of conquest it had been when he crossed the Hellespont 12 years ago. The servants' hands found the places where muscle had diminished, where the fever had carved new hollows beneath his ribs. Yet there was something peaceful in this acknowledgement of mortality, something that connected him to every man who had ever lowered himself into warm water at the end of a long day. The steam rose around him like incense, carrying with it the accumulated fatigue of empire, the weight of decisions that had shaped the world. Through the high windows, the last light of day filtered into the chamber, mixing with the glow of oil lamps to create a golden atmosphere that seemed to suspend time itself. The water continued its gentle music, the servants continued their careful ministrations, and Alexander found himself thinking not of tomorrow's audiences or the reports that awaited his attention, but of his mother's hands when he was a child, washing the dust of the training ground from his hair. The memory came unbidden, as soft and warm as the water that surrounded him now. The ritual had become sacred to him in ways he could not have anticipated. Each evening, as the servants prepared the bath, as the oils were warmed and the towels heated near the braziers, he felt himself returning to something essential, something that existed before crowns and conquests. The water accepted him without ceremony, without the elaborate prostrations of his court, without the weight of expectation that followed him through every waking hour. Here, in the gentle steam and the quiet splash of water, he was simply a man at the end of a day, no different from any soldier in his army or any citizen in his cities. The servants worked in silence, their movements creating small currents in the water that lapped against his skin like gentle reminders of the world beyond the marble walls. They had learned his preferences without being told, understanding that he required this time not for conversation or the discussion of state matters, but for the simple restoration that came from warm water and careful hands. The steam continued to rise around them all, creating a cocoon of warmth and moisture that seemed to exist outside of time, outside of the endless demands of empire. As the last of the oils was worked into his skin, as the servants began the final rinse that would prepare him for the evening's obligations, Alexander opened his eyes to watch the play of lamplight on the water's surface. Each ripple caught the light and scattered it, creating patterns that formed and dissolved with the gentle rhythm of the bath. In this moment, surrounded by the soft sounds of water and the warm presence of those who cared for him, he understood something about the nature of power that all his victories had failed to teach him. It was not in the commanding of armies or the conquest of cities that a man found peace, but in these quiet moments of surrender, these daily returns to the fundamental needs that connected him to all humanity. The warmth of the marble seemed to pulse beneath him like a living thing, each stone holding within it the heat of countless days, countless baths, countless moments of quiet restoration. He wondered about the craftsmen who had shaped these stones, who had fitted them together with such precision that the joints were barely visible, who had created this sanctuary that would outlast empires. Their hands had worked this marble when he was still a boy in Pella, dreaming of glory that seemed as distant as the stars. Now their creation held him with the same gentle firmness it had offered to kings whose names were already forgotten. The servants moved around him like figures in a dream, their soft footsteps on the marble creating a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of his heart. One of them, an elderly Persian whose face bore the weathered dignity of long service, approached with a vessel of water warmed to precisely the temperature Alexander preferred for the final rinse. The man's movements were economical, graceful, speaking of decades spent in service to those who held power, yet there was no servility in his bearing, only the quiet pride of one who had mastered his craft. The water they poured over him now had been drawn from the deep wells that fed the palace, water that had traveled through darkness and stone to reach this chamber of light and warmth. It carried with it the mineral taste of the earth itself, a reminder that even here, in this most artificial of environments, he remained connected to the natural world that existed beyond the walls of empire. The gentle cascade over his shoulders and back seemed to wash away more than the dust and fatigue of the day. It seemed to carry with it the accumulated weight of decisions made and unmade, of lives shaped by his will, of the endless burden of being the center around which the known world turned. In the growing dusk beyond the windows, he could hear the distant sounds of the palace settling into evening, the soft conversations of guards changing shifts, the gentle lowing of cattle being driven to their pens, the rustle of palm fronds in the evening breeze. These sounds seemed to emphasize rather than disturb the tranquility of the bath chamber, creating a backdrop of ordinary life that made his own moment of peace feel more precious. The steam continued to rise from the water's surface, carrying with it not just the fragrance of oils, but something more intangible, something that spoke of the eternal human need for cleansing, for renewal, for the daily return to grace that water had always provided. The silver vessels caught the lamplight and scattered it across the low table where Alexander's evening meal waited, each dish arranged with the precision that had become routine in the months since his illness. The soft clink of metal against ceramic provided a gentle percussion to the evening air, a sound that had become as familiar as breathing in the private dining chamber that overlooked the terraced gardens. Cletos moved among the dishes with the careful grace of long practice, his young hands steady as he selected small portions from each offering, the ritual unfolding with the measured pace of prayer. Alexander watched not the food, but the young Macedonian's face, searching for the subtle signs that might betray the presence of poison. It was a dance they performed each evening, this careful choreography of mistrust and protection. Yet there was something almost tender in the way Klytos approached each dish, something that spoke of devotion rather than mere duty. The evening breeze stirred the silk hangings that framed the windows, carrying with it the mingled fragrances of the gardens below and the cooking fires that burned throughout the palace complex, a symphony of scents that had become the signature of these Babylonian evenings. The necessity of the ritual troubled Alexander less than it once had. In the early years of his reign, the presence of a food taster had seemed an admission of weakness, a concession to the paranoia that plagued lesser kings. But time and experience had taught him that survival required certain accommodations, certain acknowledgments of the price that came with absolute power. Klytos had volunteered for the position after the previous taster had died not from poison, but from a fever that swept through the palace, and there had been something in the young man's eyes that spoke of understanding, of acceptance, of the strange intimacy that the role required. The oil lamps flickered in their bronze holders, casting moving shadows across the walls where maps of the empire hung like tapestries. Each flame danced with the evening air that moved through the chamber, creating a gentle illumination that softened the edges of everything it touched. Alexander found himself thinking of the thousands of meals he had shared with his companions over the years, the rough bread and wine consumed around campfires from Egypt to India, and how different this careful ritual felt from those nights of easy camaraderie. The soft rustle of Klytos's movements as he worked through the dishes seemed to emphasize the solitude that had grown around him like a wall built from the stones of necessity. Klytos paused at a dish of figs stuffed with honey and nuts, a delicacy that had become one of Alexander's favorites since arriving in Babylon. The young man's face remained calm as he tasted, but Alexander watched for the subtle signs he had learned to read over the months they had worked together. The slight widening of the eyes that might indicate bitterness, the unconscious touch of the tongue to the lips that could suggest burning, the barely perceptible hesitation that might precede the first symptoms of whatever toxin an enemy might have chosen. But Klytos's expression remained serene, and after a moment he nodded slightly, the gesture that indicated the dish was safe. The evening air continued to move through the chamber, stirring the hangings and carrying with it the distant sounds of the city settling into night. Cooking fires sent their aromatic smoke into the sky, mixing the scents of roasted meat and baking bread with the heavier fragrances of the gardens, creating an olfactory tapestry that spoke of abundance and peace. Alexander found himself wondering what Klytos thought during these long minutes of tasting, whether the young man understood the strange bond that had formed between them, this daily sharing of the possibility of death that created an intimacy more profound than friendship. As the ritual neared its end, as Klytos worked through the final dishes and the last of the wine was tested and approved, Alexander felt the familiar mixture of relief and melancholy that marked the conclusion of each evening's ceremony. The young man's careful attention to each taste, each texture, each subtle flavor that might hide danger, represented a form of devotion that humbled him. Here was someone willing to die for him, not in the heat of battle, where death might come with glory, but in the quiet performance of a daily duty where death would be anonymous and unremarked. The lamps continued their gentle flickering, the evening breeze continued to stir the hangings, and the distant sounds of the palace settling into night provided a backdrop to the completion of the ritual. When Klytos finally stepped back and bowed slightly, indicating that the meal was safe, Alexander felt not triumph, but a deep weariness. The weight of another day survived, through the careful vigilance of others. In the soft light and the gentle air of the chamber, surrounded by the evidence of abundance and security, he understood once again the price of the crown that sat upon his head. The young Macedonian's movements had acquired over the months a quality that reminded Alexander of the priests he had observed in temples across his empire, that same careful attention to ritual, that same understanding that the smallest deviation from prescribed form might invite disaster. Cleitos had developed his own methods, his own sequence of tasting that began always with the bread, moved through the various meats and vegetables, and concluded with the wine. There was wisdom in this order, Alexander had come to understand, a logic that spoke of careful thought about how different poisons might manifest, how quickly they might act, how they might be detected before it was too late. The chamber itself seemed to participate in the ritual, the way the lamplight fell across the silver vessels, creating pools of brightness that highlighted each dish as Cleitos approached it, the way the evening air carried the mingled aromas that might mask the bitter almond scent of certain toxins or the metallic tang of others. Even the silk hangings that framed the windows seemed to move in rhythm with the young man's careful progress from dish to dish, creating a gentle backdrop of motion that emphasized the deliberate nature of his work. Alexander found himself thinking of his father Philip, who had died from an assassin's blade rather than poison, and wondering whether the old king had ever imagined that his son would one day require such elaborate precautions simply to eat his evening meal. The irony was not lost on him that he, who had conquered the Persian Empire, now lived surrounded by Persian customs, protected by Persian methods, sustained by the very elaborate court rituals he had once scorned as effeminate and weak. The gentle sounds of Cleitos's work seemed to emphasize this transformation, the way conquest had changed the conqueror as much as the conquered. The wine that Cleitos tasted now came from vineyards that had been planted when Alexander was still a child, grapes that had ripened under suns that had shone on kingdoms he had not yet dreamed of conquering. The young man's careful attention to its color, its aroma, its taste, represented not just a search for poison, but a kind of communion with the vast network of cultivation and trade that sustained the empire. Each sip connected them to farmers and merchants, to ships that had carried amphorae across dangerous seas, to the countless hands that had touched this wine before it reached this chamber, this moment, this careful ritual of protection and trust. As the tasting concluded and Cleitos began to arrange the dishes for Alexander's consumption, the evening light continued to fade beyond the windows, and the lamps seemed to burn more brightly in response, creating an island of warmth and safety in the growing darkness. The young man's final bow, the gesture that released Alexander to his meal, carried with it all the weight of the day's survival, all the accumulated trust of months spent in this strange dance of risk and protection. In the gentle light and the soft evening air, surrounded by food that had been blessed by another's willingness to die for him, Alexander understood that this too was part of what it meant to rule, this daily acceptance of love offered in its most dangerous and selfless form. The scratch of reed pen against papyrus created a rhythm as steady as heartbeat in the quiet study, where scrolls lay scattered across low tables like fallen leaves after a storm. Each document brought news from a different corner of the empire, and the soft rustle of unrolling parchment had become the soundtrack to Alexander's evenings, a gentle percussion that marked the passage of time as he worked through the endless correspondence that bound his vast territories together. The lamplight flickered across maps that covered the walls, creating moving shadows that seemed to animate the borders and trade routes marked in careful ink, while the faint scent of papyrus and sealing wax filled the air with the particular fragrance of administration. A report from Ptolemy in Egypt spoke of grain shortages in the delta, the flooding of the Nile having been insufficient this year to ensure the usual abundance. Alexander made careful notes in the margins, his Greek script flowing across the papyrus with the practiced ease of years spent in correspondence with governors and generals across 3 continents. The problem was not insurmountable. Grain could be diverted from other provinces, but it required the careful coordination of resources across thousands of miles, the kind of detailed planning that had become the true work of empire, far removed from the dramatic sweep of conquest that the poets celebrated. Another scroll, this one sealed with the mark of Seleucus in Mesopotamia, detailed the construction of new irrigation channels near Ctesiphon. The work was proceeding well, but local tribal leaders had raised concerns about water rights, disputes that echoed similar conflicts from the Indus to the Danube. Alexander found himself thinking of the countless hours he had spent mediating such disagreements, the patient work of building consensus among peoples who had never shared borders before his armies had made them neighbors. The lamplight continued to dance across the papyrus as he read, creating patterns that shifted and changed like the political alliances he worked to maintain. From distant Bactria came word of unrest among the mountain tribes, nothing serious enough to require military intervention, but sufficient to require careful attention. The governor's report was thorough, detailing the grievances and suggesting solutions, but Alexander could read between the lines the exhaustion that came from governing peoples who had never been governed, from imposing order on regions that had known only the loose confederation of tribal loyalty. The soft sound of turning pages marked his progress through the document, each sheet revealing new complexities, new challenges that required his personal attention. The study existed in a bubble of lamplight and moving shadows, the flickering flames creating an atmosphere of scholarly contemplation that reminded Alexander of his youth in Pella, when Aristotle had first taught him to think systematically about the nature of governance. The philosopher had spoken of the ideal state, but he had never addressed the practical challenges of ruling peoples who spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, followed different customs. The reality of empire, Alexander had learned, lay not in grand gestures, but in the accumulation of small decisions, the careful attention to detail that these nightly sessions represented. A dispatch from Antipater in Macedonia brought news from home, the familiar places of his childhood now seeming as distant as the mountains of Afghanistan. The regent's careful prose could not entirely conceal his age, the weariness of a man who had spent too many years managing the affairs of others. Alexander found himself calculating how long it had been since he had seen the hills around Pella, the familiar landscape of his youth now existing only in memory and in these formal reports that reduced home to matters of taxation and military recruitment. The work continued as the night deepened around him, each scroll requiring careful attention, each decision rippling outward across the vast network of roads and rivers that connected his empire. The scratch of his pen provided a steady counterpoint to the soft rustle of papyrus, while the lamplight created a warm cocoon of concentration that seemed to exist outside of time. In this quiet chamber, Surrounded by the accumulated correspondence of empire, Alexander understood that this was the true nature of his achievement, not the battles that had won him territory, but the patient work of administration that held it together. As he reached for another scroll, this one bearing the seal of a governor from a city whose name had been unknown to Greeks before his conquest, Alexander felt the weight of responsibility that came with each decision, each directive that would affect the lives of thousands. The gentle sounds of his work, the scratch of pen and rustle of paper, seemed to echo across the vast distances that separated him from the people whose lives he shaped with each careful word he wrote in the margins of their reports. The oil in the lamps burned with the steady flame that had become as familiar to him as breathing, each wick drawing up the precious fuel that allowed him to continue his work long after the sun had set over the Euphrates. The light they cast seemed to create its own world within the study, a realm where distance collapsed and the farthest provinces felt as close as the gardens beyond his windows. Yet even as the lamplight made the work possible, it also emphasized the solitude of his position, the way the circle of illumination seemed to separate him from the darkness beyond, just as his authority separated him from the ordinary fellowship of men. A lengthy report from the satrap of Sogdiana detailed the establishment of new settlements along the Oxus River, Greek veterans and their families creating communities that would serve as anchors of Hellenic culture in regions where no Greek had ever lived. Alexander found himself imagining these distant outposts, the familiar rhythms of Greek life transplanted to alien landscapes, the sound of his own language spoken in valleys where only the wind had spoken before his armies passed. The settlers' children would grow up speaking Greek and Persian with equal fluency, would worship gods whose names had never been heard in Athens, would create a new kind of civilization from the marriage of cultures that his conquests had made possible. The correspondence from India required particular attention. The reports from governors who ruled territories that seemed to exist at the very edge of the known world. The monsoon rains had been favorable this year, ensuring good harvests in the river valleys, but the mountain tribes remained restless, their submission to Macedonian authority still fragile after all these years. Alexander made careful notes about troop dispositions and tribute payments, but found himself thinking more about the philosophical discussions he had enjoyed with the Indian sages, the way their ideas about the nature of existence had challenged his Greek assumptions about the world. The night air that moved through the study carried with it the mingled scents of the palace gardens and the city beyond, the heavy fragrance of jasmine mixing with the more practical aromas of cooking fires and animal pens. These scents seemed to ground him in the immediate reality of Babylon, even as his mind traveled across the empire through the medium of papyrus and ink. The gentle movement of air also stirred the flames of the oil lamps, creating subtle variations in the light that fell across his work, patterns of brightness and shadow that seemed to mirror the complex interplay of forces that held his empire together. As he worked through a detailed accounting of tax revenues from the Syrian provinces, Alexander found himself thinking about the thousands of scribes and administrators who made such reports possible, the vast bureaucratic machinery that had grown up around his person like a living organism. Each figure represented not just abstract wealth, but the labor of farmers and merchants, the patient work of cultivation and trade that sustained the elaborate structure of empire. The gentle scratch of his pen as he made calculations and corrections seemed to connect him directly to this vast network of human effort, making him feel both the weight of his responsibility and the strange intimacy of ruling lives he would never see. The scrolls continued to accumulate around him as the night deepened, each one requiring not just his attention, but his decision, his personal judgment about matters that would affect the lives of thousands. The soft sounds of his work, the rustle of papyrus and the scratch of pen, the gentle sigh of his breath as he considered difficult problems seemed to fill the study with a kind of music, the quiet symphony of administration that few would ever hear, but upon which the stability of the known world depended. In this atmosphere of concentrated attention, surrounded by the evidence of his empire's complexity and his own central role in maintaining its balance, Alexander understood that this too was a form of conquest, this daily victory over chaos and dissolution that required not sword and spear but patience and wisdom, and the willingness to remain awake long after others had surrendered to sleep. The terraced pathways of the hanging gardens wound upward through layers of carefully tended paradise, each level revealing new perspectives on the ancient city that sprawled below in the moonlight. Alexander's sandals made the softest whisper against the stone as he climbed, the sound barely audible above the gentle trickle of water that flowed through channels carved into the garden's architecture, creating a continuous music that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. The night air carried the fragrance of flowers that bloomed only in darkness, their perfume mixing with the earthier scents of rich soil and growing things, while the distant lights of Babylon reflected on the dark surface of the Euphrates like fallen stars. He had begun these nightly walks during his recovery from the fever, when the physicians had prescribed gentle exercise and fresh air. But what had started as medical necessity had become something more essential, a daily pilgrimage through this artificial paradise that Nebuchadnezzar had built for a homesick queen. The gardens at night became a different world from their daytime splendor, the harsh edges softened by moonlight, the elaborate engineering hidden beneath the natural beauty of growing things. Water whispered through the irrigation channels with the persistence of prayer, and Alexander found himself following its sound as much as the pathways, drawn upward through the ascending levels of this ancient dream made manifest. Each terrace offered its own collection of wonders, plants brought from every corner of the known world, and some from beyond it. He paused beside a fountain where lotus blossoms floated on the dark water, their white petals luminous in the moonlight. The soft splash of water falling from level to level created a rhythm that seemed to match his heartbeat, while the night breeze moved through the leaves with the gentleness of a mother's touch. From this height he could see the palace complex spread below him, its courtyards and gardens laid out in patterns that spoke of centuries of careful planning, of dynasties that had risen and fallen while these stones remained. The guards who followed him maintained their distance, understanding that these walks required solitude. Their presence was felt rather than seen, a careful protection that allowed him the illusion of being alone with his thoughts in this elevated paradise. The water continued its gentle song as he climbed higher, past groves of date palms whose fronds whispered secrets to the night wind, past beds of roses whose thorns caught the moonlight like tiny daggers. The engineering that made this miracle possible was hidden beneath the surface, the complex system of pumps and channels that lifted water from the river below, invisible in the darkness, leaving only the evidence of their success in the lush growth that surrounded him. At the highest level, Alexander paused beside a reflecting pool where the moon's image floated among the lily pads, its light scattered into fragments by the gentle movement of the water. The city spread below him like a map drawn in silver and shadow, the great walls of Babylon enclosing a world that had existed for centuries before his birth and would continue long after his death. The thought brought not melancholy, but a strange comfort, the recognition that he was part of something larger than his own ambitions, a single note in a symphony that had been playing since the first cities rose from the Mesopotamian plain. The night air moved through the gardens with the consistency of breathing, stirring the leaves and carrying with it the complex fragrance of this artificial Eden. Jasmine and orange blossom mixed with the earthier scents of herbs and vegetables, creating an olfactory tapestry that spoke of abundance and careful cultivation. Alexander found himself thinking of the queen for whom this paradise had been built, wondering if she had found comfort in these foreign plants, if the sight of familiar flowers had eased her homesickness or only made it more acute. Here, among the carefully tended beds of medicinal herbs, he could smell the sharp sweetness of mint and the dusty fragrance of sage, plants that the palace physicians used in their endless preparations. The water that nourished these healing gardens flowed with the same constancy as his own blood, carrying life to every corner of this suspended world. He knelt beside a patch of chamomile, its small white flowers glowing like stars fallen to earth, and breathed in their apple-sweet scent that spoke of peaceful sleep and gentle dreams. The terraces descended in perfect mathematical progression, each level precisely calculated to catch the maximum light and water, yet the effect was one of natural abundance rather than human artifice. Vines heavy with grapes cascaded over retaining walls built of stones quarried from distant mountains, their leaves rustling with the sound of silk brushed by gentle fingers. The irrigation channels that fed this paradise had been carved by craftsmen whose names were lost to history, yet their work continued, patient and invisible, carrying the river's gift to every growing thing. As he walked deeper into the garden's heart, Alexander found himself following pathways that seemed to lead not just through space, but through time itself. The ancient cedars that anchored the highest terraces had been seedlings when his grandfather was young, their roots now reaching deep into the artificial soil that generations of gardeners had built and tended. Their branches spread like protective arms over smaller trees and shrubs, creating groves within the garden where the moonlight filtered through layers of leaves in patterns that shifted with each breath of wind. The fountain at the garden's center had been designed to catch and amplify the slightest breeze, so that the water's song changed subtly with the wind's direction, sometimes a whisper, sometimes a gentle murmur, always present like the pulse of some great heart. Alexander sat on the marble bench beside this fountain, feeling the fine mist that rose from its basin cool against his skin. The water fell from basin to basin in a series of small cascades, each drop beginning its journey at the garden's peak and ending in the channels that carried it back to the river below. In this suspended world between earth and sky, he found himself thinking not of battles won or territories conquered, but of the simple persistence of growing things, the way water found its level, the patience of stones worn smooth by centuries of gentle flow. The garden taught lessons that no tutor had ever offered, spoke of time measured not in the span of human ambition, but in the slow accumulation of seasons, the gradual deepening of roots, the quiet work of transformation that happened when no one was watching. The night deepened around him, and with it came the subtle shift in the garden's atmosphere that marked the passage from evening into the deep hours of darkness. Flowers that had closed their petals at sunset began to open again, releasing fragrances reserved for the night air. The water's song seemed to grow more complex, as though the darkness freed it to speak in voices that daylight muted. Alexander felt his own breathing slow to match this nocturnal rhythm, his heartbeat settling into harmony with the garden's ancient pulse. As he began his descent, following a different path that wound through groves of fruit trees heavy with their evening perfume, Alexander felt the accumulated peace of the garden settling around him like a cloak. The water continued its eternal song, the night breeze continued its gentle ministrations, and the city below continued its ancient rhythms of sleep and waking. In this suspended world between earth and sky, between the natural and the artificial, he found a tranquility that eluded him in the marble halls of the palace, a sense of connection to something that transcended the temporary nature of human ambition. The guards fell into step behind him as he reached the lower terraces, their presence a reminder of the world that waited beyond the garden walls. But for these precious hours, in the gentle atmosphere of flowing water and night-blooming flowers, Alexander had found something that all his conquests had failed to provide. A moment of perfect peace, suspended between the achievements of the past and the uncertainties of tomorrow, in a paradise built by hands long turned to dust, but sustained by the eternal human desire to create beauty in a world that too often knew only the harsh necessities of survival. The fever announced itself not through violence or sudden heat, but through the peculiar way the silk sheets seemed to whisper more insistently against his skin, as though they carried messages he had never learned to read. Alexander lay in his bedchamber, surrounded by the accumulated treasures of a dozen conquered kingdoms, Persian carpets spread beneath Macedonian furniture in a harmony that spoke of empire's strange democracy. The single oil lamp cast its steady glow across walls hung with tapestries from Samarkand, their golden threads catching light like captured stars, while shadows moved with the lamp's gentle flame in a rhythm that matched his increasingly labored breathing. The room held the accumulated stillness of palace nights, where even the changing of guards occurred with the practiced silence of those who understood that power often slept lightly. Through the carved window screens came the perpetual murmur of Babylon's fountains, a sound that had provided the city's heartbeat for centuries before his arrival and would continue long after his departure. This constant whisper of water over stone created an atmosphere of timeless continuity, as though the city itself breathed through its ancient waterways, indifferent to the rise and fall of kings. He recognized the sensation from recent weeks, this subtle shift in his body's relationship with itself, the way his skin seemed suddenly too thin, too permeable to the world's influences. But tonight carried a different quality, a completeness in the fever's claim that spoke not of temporary illness, but of something more fundamental, more final. His heartbeat had become audible to him, a steady percussion against his ribs that seemed to echo in the room's corners, joining the fountain's whisper in a duet he had never noticed before. The Persian carpets beneath his bed held patterns that seemed to shift in the lamplight, geometric designs that had once adorned the floors of Darius's palace, now serving a Macedonian king who lay dying in the heart of the empire he had conquered. There was something almost comic in this arrangement, he thought, this mingling of cultures in the democracy of his bedchamber, where Babylonian incense burned beside Macedonian wine, where Asian silk covered a body trained in Greek gymnasiums and hardened on European battlefields. His breathing had developed its own rhythm, deeper and more deliberate than usual, as though his lungs were learning a new song. The fever brought with it a strange clarity, a sharpening of perception that made every detail of the room seem significant. The grain of the wooden furniture, carved by craftsmen whose names were lost to history, told stories of forests that had grown for decades before his birth. The tapestries held the labor of women who had worked by lamplight much like this, their fingers creating beauty in the space between one breath and the next. He had always been a creature of movement, of action translated immediately into consequence. Even in stillness, his mind had raced ahead to the next campaign, the next impossible crossing, the next city that would fall before his advance. But now, with fever beginning its slow work, he found himself inhabiting a different kind of time, one measured not in victories or distances covered, but in the space between heartbeats, in the gentle persistence of fountain water finding its level. The lamp's flame held steady, fed by oil pressed from olives that had grown in groves he had never seen, tended by hands he would never know. There was comfort in this anonymity, in the way his fever connected him to the vast network of human labor that sustained even kings. Someone had woven these sheets, someone had carved these window screens, someone had mixed the incense that now carried its smoke toward the painted ceiling where Babylonian stars looked down with the same indifference they had shown to Nebuchadnezzar. His body's rebellion came not as betrayal, but as a kind of honesty, a democracy of flesh that recognized no distinction between conqueror and conquered. The fever made philosophers of them all, he reflected, stripping away the accumulated layers of achievement and ambition until only the essential remained: breath, heartbeat, the body's patient work of being alive. In this state, the distance between himself and the humblest soldier in his army collapsed into nothing. The shadows on the walls moved with a hypnotic regularity, cast by the lamp's unwavering flame into shapes that suggested now a horse's head, now a mountain peak, now the profile of some god whose name had been forgotten before Homer sang his songs. These shifting forms provided a kind of entertainment for his fever-sharpened senses, a theater of light and darkness that required no audience beyond himself. He thought of his mother, Olympias, who had always claimed he was born for greatness, marked by signs and portents that she read in everything from snake dreams to the timing of thunderstorms. Perhaps she would find meaning in this too, in the way his fever chose to return on this particular night, in this particular room, surrounded by the spoils of the world he had remade. Or perhaps she would simply see what he was beginning to see. That greatness, like fever, was something that passed through a person rather than belonging to them. The fountain's whisper seemed to grow more distinct as the night deepened, as though the city were sharing its secrets with someone who would soon join the ranks of its ancient dead. Babylon had outlasted empires before, had seen conquerors come and go like seasons, each leaving their mark on its stones, while the water continued its patient work of wearing everything smooth. In the fever's clarity, he could almost hear the conversations of kings who had lain in chambers like this one, feeling their bodies' quiet insurrection against the will's commands. The incense that burned in the corner of the room carried with it the accumulated prayers of centuries, smoke that had risen from altars before his birth and would continue rising after his death. its fragrance mixed with the fever's heat to create an atmosphere that seemed both intimate and eternal, as though the room itself had become a temple where the god being worshipped was the simple fact of being alive. Each breath he drew carried this sacred smoke deeper into his lungs, where it joined the fever's work of transformation. He found himself studying the ceiling with new attention, noting how the painted stars followed patterns that astronomers had mapped when the world was younger, when the distance between earth and heaven seemed smaller than it did now. The fever had given him the patience for such observations, the ability to find fascination in details that his restless mind had always passed over in its hurry toward the next objective. Now, with time stretching before him like an uncharted sea, he could afford to notice how the lamp's light caught the gold leaf applied by artists whose skills had been passed down through generations of palace decorators. The silk sheets that covered him had been woven in workshops where women sang while they worked, their voices joining in harmonies that helped them maintain the rhythm necessary for creating fabric of such fineness. He could almost hear those songs now, carried to him across the years by threads that had absorbed not just dyes and oils, but something of the lives that had created them. The fever made him sensitive to these hidden histories, these layers of human experience embedded in every object that surrounded him. His breathing settled into a rhythm that matched the fountain's constancy, and in this synchronization he found a peace that had eluded him through all his years of conquest. The fever was teaching him something about surrender, about the grace that came when the body finally overruled the mind's restless ambitions. Here, in the democracy of illness, Alexander the Great became simply Alexander, a man lying in a room where shadows danced and water sang its eternal song. The night air that moved through the carved screens carried with it not just the fountain's music, but the accumulated breath of the city, the exhalations of thousands of sleepers who lay dreaming in chambers both humble and grand. This shared atmosphere connected him to every other person in Babylon, from the slaves who tended the palace fires to the merchants who counted their profits in rooms above the marketplace. The fever had made him part of this larger breathing, this collective rhythm of life that continued regardless of individual ambition or achievement. As the hours passed, Alexander found himself entering a state that was neither sleep nor waking, but something between the two, a twilight consciousness where the boundaries between himself and the room, between his fever and the city's ancient pulse, began to dissolve. The fountain's whisper became his own breathing, the lamp's flame became the steady beating of his heart, and the shadows on the walls became the thoughts that moved through his mind with the same gentle persistence as water finding its way to the sea. The map spread before Alexander like a confession of impossibility. Each parchment curled at its edges despite the bronze figurines that held them flat, as if the very geography refused to be contained. The lamplight flickered across the detailed coastlines and mountain ranges, casting shadows that seemed to shift the territories themselves, making the Indus appear closer to Babylon than farther, as if distance were merely a trick of illumination. He traced the route from Babylon to Alexandria with one finger, feeling the roughness of the papyrus beneath his touch. The line seemed so simple, so direct, yet he knew it represented months of travel, countless lives that would be born and die in the time it took for a message to travel between these 2 points. His finger paused at each marked city, each dot of ink that represented thousands of souls who lived their entire lives without knowing his name, who woke each morning to concerns that had nothing to do with his empire. The trade routes spread like veins across the known world, connecting his conquests in a network of commerce and communication that should have made him feel powerful. Instead, standing in this chamber surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of his cartographers, Alexander felt the weight of distance pressing against his chest. The maps revealed not mastery, but the profound loneliness of ruling places he would never see again. A gentle breeze drifted through the high windows, causing the papyrus to whisper against itself in soft, rustling conversations. The sound reminded him of leaves in autumn, of the impermanence that touched everything, even these careful representations of his empire. The oil flames danced in their bronze holders, creating a gentle rhythmic flickering that played across the scrolls lining the walls. Each scroll contained more knowledge than any one man could absorb, more detail than any ruler could truly comprehend. He moved around the table slowly, his sandals making soft sounds on the stone floor. The air carried the faint scent of ink and parchment, mixed with the distant fragrance of night-blooming jasmine from the gardens below. These were the smells of accumulated learning, of human attempts to capture and contain the world through symbols and measurements. Yet standing here, surrounded by all this knowledge, Alexander understood that the maps showed him only surfaces. His finger found the marking for the city of Bucephala, named for his horse, and he paused there longer than at the others. Bucephalus had died there on the banks of the Hydaspes, and Alexander had founded the city to honor him, but the horse had never seen the maps, had never needed to understand the distances they traveled. Bucephalus had simply carried him forward, day after day, trusting in the journey itself rather than in any destination. The shadows moved slowly across the detailed cartography as the flames swayed, creating an almost hypnotic dance of light and darkness over the represented territories. Alexander watched a shadow fall across the mountains of the Hindu Kush, then lift to reveal them again, as if the very geography were breathing. These lines and symbols represented places where people lived and died according to rhythms older than his conquests, where seasons changed and crops grew regardless of who claimed dominion over them. He traced the coastline of the Arabian Peninsula, a territory that remained unconquered, its edges marked with the careful notation of his geographers. Extent unknown. The honesty of this admission pleased him more than all the precisely measured distances of his established empire. Here was acknowledgement that the world contained mysteries larger than any one man's ambition, spaces that existed beyond the reach of bronze figurines and careful measurements. The room held the profound quiet of accumulated knowledge, broken only by the soft whisper of his movement and the gentle flutter of flames. Alexander understood now that these maps, for all their precision, could never capture the true nature of distance. They could show him the paths between cities, but not the longing of a soldier for home. They could mark the locations of his victories, but not the weight of years that settled on a man who had traveled too far from everything familiar. As he stood there in the flickering lamplight, surrounded by the paper representations of his life's work, Alexander felt a strange peace settle over him. The maps revealed the impossibility of his dream, but they also showed its magnificent scope. He had connected worlds that had never touched, had created routes where none existed, had made the distant familiar and the foreign accessible. The lines on these maps represented not just territories conquered, but barriers overcome, differences bridged, the expansion of what human beings believed possible. The night air stirred the papers again, and in their soft rustling, Alexander heard something like approval. The maps would outlast him, would guide travelers and traders long after his name became legend. The routes he had opened would carry goods and ideas across distances that had once seemed impossible to cross. In the morning, other men would stand before these same maps, tracing their own journeys, adding their own discoveries to the accumulated knowledge of the world. He extinguished one of the lamps, watching as the circle of light contracted, leaving portions of his empire in shadow. The gesture felt appropriate somehow, an acknowledgement that no single vision could illuminate everything, that there would always be territories beyond the reach of any one man's understanding. The remaining flames continued their gentle dance, casting their warm light over the maps that had become, in this quiet moment, not symbols of conquest, but invitations to wonder. The parchments seemed to settle more deeply against the table as the air cooled, their edges relaxing into acceptance of their positions. Alexander found himself thinking of the scribes who had copied these maps, the careful hands that had traced each coastline and mountain range with patient precision. They had never seen most of these places, had worked from descriptions and measurements provided by others, yet their dedication had created these windows into distant worlds. In the reduced light, the colors of the maps appeared more muted, the blues of rivers and seas deepening into something that suggested not just water, but the passage of time itself. The browns and greens of land masses took on the quality of earth viewed from a great height, as if he were seeing his empire from the perspective of the gods themselves. This elevated view revealed patterns invisible from ground level, connections that could only be perceived when one stepped back from the immediate concerns of rule and conquest. Alexander picked up one of the smaller maps, holding it closer to the remaining lamp. This one showed the route from Pella to Babylon, the path that had taken him from the familiar hills of Macedonia to the heart of an empire he had never expected to inherit. The distances marked along this route told the story of his transformation from a young prince to a king of many nations, each mile representing not just physical travel, but psychological change. The map's surface was worn smooth in places where other hands had traced the same routes, where other minds had contemplated the same distances. Alexander wondered about these previous viewers, what questions they had brought to these representations of space and time. Had they, like him, felt the vertigo that came from seeing one's life reduced to lines on parchment, to measurements that could be contained within the span of outstretched arms? The gentle night breeze continued to move through the chamber, carrying with it the sounds of the palace settling into sleep. Somewhere in the distance, a guard called softly to his replacement, the words indistinct, but the tone familiar and comforting. These were the sounds of an empire at rest, of a vast organization of human activity gradually quieting as darkness deepened. The maps before him represented all of this, but they could not capture the human rhythms that gave meaning to the territories they depicted. Alexander set the small map back on the table and stepped away, moving to the window where the night air was cooler and fresher. From this height, he could see the lights of Babylon spread below him, each flame representing a household, a family, a collection of individual lives proceeding according to their own internal logic. The city from this perspective looked like a constellation fallen to earth, its patterns of light and shadow creating a beauty that no map could adequately represent. Returning to the table, he began to roll the largest map with careful, deliberate movements. The parchment crackled softly as it curved back upon itself, the detailed geography disappearing into the simple cylinder that would preserve it for future consultation. As he worked, Alexander reflected on the strange relationship between knowledge and understanding, between the accumulation of information and the wisdom that came from accepting the limits of what could be known. The final lamp burned lower now, its flame smaller, but no less steady in its bronze holder. In this diminished light, the remaining maps took on an almost mystical quality, their details softened into suggestions rather than declarations. Alexander understood that this was perhaps the most accurate way to view his empire, not as a collection of precisely defined territories, but as a network of possibilities, a web of connections that existed as much in the realm of imagination as in physical reality. As he prepared to leave the chamber, Alexander took one last look at the maps that remained spread on the table. In the morning, his advisors would return to study these same documents, would make decisions based on the information they contained, would dispatch messengers and armies according to the routes they depicted. But tonight, in this quiet moment between day and night, the maps existed simply as beautiful objects, as testimonies to human curiosity and the endless desire to understand the world's true dimensions. The Persian noble entered with the careful dignity of a man who had learned to navigate the spaces between cultures. His robes whispered against the stone floor as he approached, carrying before him a bundle wrapped in silk that seemed to hold more weight than its size suggested. Alexander watched from his chair as the elderly man's careful eyes took in the room, noting the Greek furnishings mixed with Babylonian tapestries, the bronze braziers casting their gentle warmth into air already scented with sandalwood incense. The carpet unrolled with a sound like water flowing over stones, revealing colors that seemed to breathe in the firelight. Alexander had seen many Persian carpets, had walked across them in palaces from Persepolis to Ecbatana, but this one drew him forward from his chair without conscious decision. The weaving depicted a garden where lions rested beside deer, where rivers flowed in perfect geometric patterns that somehow suggested both order and wildness, control and freedom. The Persian spoke in careful Greek, his accent lending a musical quality to words that described the carpet's creation. 3 years to complete, he said, the work of a master weaver whose grandfather had served the court of Darius. The dyes came from specific flowers that bloomed only in certain seasons, gathered by women who sang particular songs to ensure the colors would hold their vibrancy. As the man spoke, Alexander knelt beside the carpet, drawn by details that revealed themselves slowly in the dancing light. The silk threads felt impossibly soft beneath his fingers, each one placed with an intention that spoke of patience Alexander had never possessed. The lions in the garden were not the fierce beasts of his military standards, but creatures at rest, their eyes holding a wisdom that seemed to acknowledge the temporary nature of all dominion. The deer beside them appeared not as prey, but as equals, sharing the same eternal moment of peace that the weaver had captured in thread and dye. Incense burned slowly in corner holders, releasing thin streams of aromatic smoke that curled upward in lazy spirals, carrying with them the mingled scents of distant places. The stone walls were hung with tapestries that muffled sound, creating an intimate space where the Persian's voice carried in soft, measured tones. Alexander found himself listening not just to the words, but to the rhythm of the man's speech, the way his careful Greek carried undertones of his native tongue, like water flowing over familiar stones. The carpet itself seemed to breathe with color in the firelight, its intricate patterns shifting subtly as shadows played across its surface. Alexander traced the geometric rivers with one finger, following their flow from the garden's center toward edges that suggested continuation beyond the carpet's borders. The pattern implied infinite extension, gardens within gardens, rivers feeding into larger rivers, a vision of paradise that acknowledged no boundaries. The Persian watched Alexander's face with knowing patience, seeing something there that Alexander was only beginning to recognize himself. The old man's eyes held the accumulated wisdom of a culture that had learned to survive conquest by absorbing its conquerors, by offering gifts so beautiful that possession became transformation. He had brought this carpet not as tribute to a foreign king, but as an invitation to understanding. As Alexander continued to study the weaving, he began to see that the garden depicted was not Persian or Greek, but something beyond such distinctions. The flowers that provided the dyes grew in many lands. The geometric patterns echoed forms found in nature everywhere. The lions and deer represented forces that existed in all climates and cultures. The carpet was a vision of unity that transcended the boundaries marked on his maps. The air in the antechamber was still and warm, filled with the gentle sounds of the Persians' breathing and the soft crackle of flames in their braziers. Alexander realized that he had been holding his breath, so absorbed had he become in the carpet's intricate beauty. When he finally looked up at the Persian noble, he saw in the man's patient expression a recognition of what was happening, not the presentation of tribute, but the passing of understanding from one generation to another. The Persian began to speak again, this time about the garden the carpet depicted. It was not, he explained, a representation of any earthly place, but a vision of the paradise that existed in the space between cultures, in the moment when differences dissolved into shared appreciation of beauty. The weaver had created it as a gift for his own grandson, but the grandson had died in the wars that preceded Alexander's arrival. Now the carpet sought a new home, a new guardian who might understand its message. Alexander stood slowly, his knees stiff from kneeling on the stone floor. The carpet lay before him like an opened book written in a language he was only beginning to learn. He understood now that he had not conquered Persia so much as been absorbed by it, that his empire had become a weaving of cultures as intricate as the patterns beneath his feet. The Greek in him had been changed by contact with Persian wisdom, Babylonian astronomy, Indian philosophy, Egyptian mysticism. The Persian noble began to roll the carpet with movements that spoke of long practice, but Alexander stopped him with a gesture. The carpet would remain here, in this room where East and West met in the person of a Macedonian king who had traveled too far to ever return unchanged. The gift had been accepted not as tribute but as teaching, not as possession but as responsibility. As the Persian prepared to leave, he paused at the chamber's entrance and spoke once more in his careful Greek. The carpet, he said, would outlast them both, would carry its beauty into futures neither of them could imagine. In accepting it, Alexander had accepted the burden and privilege of preservation, of ensuring that beauty survived the temporary nature of all earthly power. Alone again with the carpet, Alexander felt the weight of this new understanding settle around him like the incense smoke that continued to curl upward from its holders. The geometric rivers seemed to flow more freely now, the lions and deer to rest more peacefully, as if the carpet itself had found the home it had been seeking. The gift had transformed both giver and receiver. creating a connection that transcended the usual relationships between conqueror and conquered. The flames in the braziers burned with steady warmth, their light playing across the carpet's surface in patterns that seemed to echo the weaving's own intricate design. Alexander found himself thinking of all the hands that had touched this creation, the weaver who had spent 3 years of his life bringing it into existence, the women who had gathered the flowers for dyes while singing their ancient songs, the Persian noble who had carried it across distances to place it before a foreign king. Each thread in the carpet represented a decision, a moment when the weaver had chosen one color over another, one pattern over countless alternatives. The accumulated effect of these thousands of individual choices was a harmony that spoke of deep understanding, of a vision that could hold complexity without losing coherence. Alexander realized that this was what he had been seeking in his own life, a way to weave together the disparate elements of his empire into something that possessed this same quality of unified beauty. The incense smoke continued its lazy ascent, creating shifting veils of scented air that softened the edges of everything in the chamber. In this gentle haze, the carpet seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its physical presence enhanced by the spiritual significance the Persian had revealed. Alexander understood now that he was not merely looking at a decorative object, but at a teaching device, a meditation on the possibility of harmony between opposing forces. The silence that followed the Persian's departure was not empty but full, pregnant with the implications of what had just occurred. Alexander felt as though he had received not just a carpet, but a new way of seeing, a perspective that could transform his understanding of what it meant to rule an empire composed of so many different peoples and traditions. The geometric patterns beneath his feet suggested that diversity and unity were not contradictory but complementary, that the richness of the whole depended on the distinctiveness of its parts. As he prepared to leave the antechamber, Alexander took one final look at the carpet that would now become a permanent part of his private quarters. The Persian's gift had accomplished something that no military victory could achieve. It had changed the conqueror's understanding of what conquest truly meant. In accepting the carpet, Alexander had accepted the responsibility of becoming worthy of the beauty that had been entrusted to his care, of ensuring that his empire became a space where such creations could flourish and endure. Philip sat beside the bed with the stillness of a man who had learned to measure his words against the weight of accumulated uncertainty. His weathered hands rested in his lap, fingers interlaced in a gesture that spoke of prayers offered and unanswered, of remedies attempted and failed. The single oil lamp cast a small circle of warm light around them, creating a pool of intimacy in the larger darkness of the bedchamber. Alexander watched the physician's face in the gentle illumination, seeing there the lines carved by years of following armies across impossible distances, of treating wounds and fevers in climates that defied Greek understanding of medicine. Philip had been with him since the early campaigns in Asia, had learned alongside Alexander the limitations of knowledge when confronted with the vastness of an unknown world. The old man's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper, as if the confession he was about to make required the protection of near silence. He admitted what Alexander had already known, but had never heard spoken aloud, that the illness defied all understanding, that the remedies had been guesses dressed as certainty, attempts to impose familiar solutions on unfamiliar problems. Philip spoke of the limits of Greek medicine when confronted with diseases born of foreign climates and strange foods, of how the body could rebel against experiences it was never meant to endure. He described the way Alexander's constitution had been changed by years of adaptation to different waters, different airs, different rhythms of heat and cold. The physician's training had prepared him for the wounds of battle and the familiar fevers of Macedonia, not for the mysterious ailments that arose from pushing human endurance beyond all previous boundaries. The flame burned steadily in its bronze holder, creating a pool of golden illumination that seemed to hold the two men in intimate conversation. Beyond the light, shadows gathered softly in the corners, not threatening but protective, like a cocoon of privacy that allowed for the kind of honesty that daylight often discouraged. The air was still and warm, carrying the faint scent of olive oil from the lamp and the clean smell of linen. As Philip continued his confession, Alexander listened without judgment, recognizing in the physician's words a mirror of his own limitations as a ruler. There was relief in this honesty, in the admission that some things could not be conquered or comprehended through force of will or accumulation of knowledge. The physician's trembling hands spoke of the weight of accumulated uncertainty, of years spent pretending to certainties he had never possessed. Philip described the remedies he had tried, drawing from Egyptian knowledge and Persian wisdom, from Indian practices and Babylonian astronomy. Each attempt had been made with genuine hope, but also with the growing understanding that Alexander's condition arose from sources beyond the reach of any single medical tradition. The king's body had become a meeting place of influences, a battlefield where different systems of understanding competed without resolution. The physician's voice carried the particular exhaustion that came from fighting battles that could not be won through conventional means. He spoke of nights spent consulting scrolls and questioning local healers, of days spent mixing compounds whose effectiveness could only be measured against the progression of symptoms that followed no familiar pattern. The illness seemed to exist in the spaces between medical traditions, in the gaps where different systems of knowledge failed to connect. Alexander found himself thinking of the maps in his study, of the territories marked extent unknown that had pleased him with their honest acknowledgement of mystery. Philip's confession carried the same quality of truthful limitation, the recognition that human understanding had boundaries as real as those marked by his cartographers. There was something almost peaceful in this admission, a release from the burden of pretending to knowledge that did not exist. The night was so quiet that the soft breathing of both men became part of the room's rhythm, creating a sense of shared solitude and mutual understanding. Alexander realized that Philip's confession was also an act of trust, an offering of vulnerability that matched his own acceptance of physical decline. They were both men who had traveled too far from the certainties of their youth, who had learned that experience could teach humility as readily as wisdom. Philip spoke of the way Alexander's illness seemed to embody the very journey they had taken together, as if the king's body were attempting to process and integrate all the foreign influences it had encountered. The fevers came in patterns that reminded the physician of seasonal changes in distant climates. The weakness followed rhythms that seemed to echo the long marches across unfamiliar terrain. It was as if Alexander were experiencing, in concentrated form, all the adjustments his body had never had time to make gradually. The physician's hands had stopped trembling as he spoke, as if the act of confession had steadied him. He described his growing understanding that healing, in this case, might not mean restoration to a previous state, but rather acceptance of transformation. Alexander's body had been changed by its journey, had become something new that could not be measured against Greek standards of health and vigor. As Philip's voice faded into the gentle silence of the chamber, Alexander felt a profound gratitude for the old man's honesty. The confession had transformed the illness from a source of anxiety into an object of philosophical contemplation, from a problem to be solved into a mystery to be accepted. The physician had given him the gift of uncertainty acknowledged, of limitation embraced rather than denied. The oil lamp continued its steady burning, casting the same warm light that had illuminated their conversation. Alexander understood now that Philip's medical knowledge, like his own military genius, was both powerful and bounded, capable of great achievements within its proper sphere, but helpless when confronted with phenomena that transcended familiar categories. The confession had been an act of courage equal to any battlefield bravery, the willingness to admit the limits of expertise in the face of infinite complexity. In the growing quiet that followed Philip's words, Alexander felt the peace that came from shared acknowledgement of mystery. The illness would follow its own course, guided by forces beyond their understanding or control, but it would do so in the company of honest uncertainty rather than false certainty. The physician had given him the most valuable gift possible, the permission to stop fighting battles that could not be won, to find comfort in the unknown rather than fear. The lamp's flame flickered slightly as a gentle draft moved through the chamber, but it steadied quickly, resuming its quiet burning. Alexander watched this small drama of light and shadow, seeing in it a metaphor for the conversation that had just concluded. Like the flame, their understanding had wavered momentarily in the face of uncertainty, but had found its balance again in acceptance of what could not be controlled or fully comprehended. Philip began to speak again, his voice even softer now, describing the strange comfort he had found in abandoning the pretense of medical omniscience. The relief of admitting ignorance had freed him to observe more carefully, to listen more attentively to what Alexander's body was actually communicating rather than what medical theory suggested it should be saying. In this state of acknowledged uncertainty, the physician had begun to perceive patterns that his previous confidence had obscured. The old man described how Alexander's illness seemed to follow rhythms that connected it to larger cycles, to the movements of seasons and the phases of the moon, to the subtle influences that ancient peoples had recognized, but that Greek medicine had largely dismissed. Perhaps, Philip suggested, the body possessed its own wisdom, its own ways of processing experiences that exceeded the mind's capacity to understand or direct. Alexander listened to these words with a growing sense of recognition. His own experience of leadership had taught him similar lessons about the limits of conscious control, about the necessity of trusting in processes that operated beyond the reach of deliberate intention. The empire had grown and evolved according to its own internal logic, shaped by forces that no single mind could fully grasp or guide. The chamber seemed to grow even quieter as Philip's voice faded once more into contemplative silence. The lamp's steady burning created a sense of timelessness, as if this moment of shared understanding existed outside the normal progression of hours and days. Alexander felt that he and the physician had entered a space of mutual recognition, a place where the usual roles of king and subject, patient and healer, had dissolved into something more fundamental. Philip rose slowly from his chair, his movements careful and deliberate. The confession was complete, the burden of false certainty had been lifted, and both men understood that something essential had been accomplished in this quiet exchange. The physician gathered his simple medical supplies with the same careful attention he had always shown, but now his movements carried a different quality, a peace that came from having spoken truth rather than offering false comfort. As Philip prepared to leave, he paused at the bedside and placed his hand briefly on Alexander's forehead. The gesture was not medical but personal, an acknowledgement of the bond that had been strengthened through honest admission of limitation. The old man's touch carried decades of loyalty and care, but also the wisdom that came from accepting the boundaries of what any one person could do for another. Alone again in the gentle lamplight, Alexander felt the profound stillness that followed moments of authentic communication. Philip's confession had given him something more valuable than false hope or medical reassurance. It had given him the companionship of shared uncertainty, the comfort of knowing that his experience of limitation was not unique, but part of the larger human condition. In accepting the mystery of his illness, Alexander had found a new form of peace, one that did not depend on control or understanding, but on the simple recognition that some things were larger than any individual will or wisdom. At the deepest level of the hanging gardens, Alexander moved among impossibilities made manifest through human will and Persian ingenuity. The air was thick with moisture, and the mingled fragrances of flowers that should never bloom together. Mountain jasmine beside desert roses, northern pines growing near tropical vines, each plant sustained by an elaborate system of channels and pumps that brought water from the Euphrates in defiance of natural law. Water moved constantly through hidden channels carved into the stone terraces, creating a gentle, continuous murmur that seemed to come from the earth itself. The sound was everywhere and nowhere, a liquid music that pulsed with the rhythm of life artificially sustained. Alexander touched the leaves of trees from distant mountains, feeling their texture beneath his fingers, marveling at their presence in this desert city where they had no natural right to exist. Moonlight filtered down through the terraced levels above, creating dappled patterns of silver and shadow on the pathways that wound between the planted beds. The stone channels gleamed wetly in the dim light, their surfaces worn smooth by the constant flow of water that made this paradise possible. Alexander followed one channel with his eyes, tracing its path as it disappeared into the darkness beneath overhanging vines, then emerged again to feed a pool where lotus flowers floated like stars on the dark surface. The gardens represented the same impulse that had driven his conquests, the desire to gather the world's beauty in one place, to create something that transcended natural limits through the application of human ambition and engineering skill. Yet as he walked among the carefully tended beds, Alexander saw how the gardeners must work constantly to maintain this paradise, how quickly it would return to desert without their perpetual care and attention. Each plant told a story of displacement and adaptation, of roots learning to draw sustenance from foreign soil, of leaves adjusting to light filtered through alien atmospheres. The gardens were a living map of his empire, containing specimens from every territory he had conquered, brought here to create a unity that existed nowhere else in nature. The roses of Persia grew beside the cedars of Lebanon, the spices of India flourished next to the herbs of Macedonia. The sound of water was everywhere, dripping from leaf to leaf, flowing through channels carved with geometric precision, pooling in basins designed to reflect the moon and stars. Alexander paused beside one such pool, watching the ripples disturb the reflected light, creating patterns that shifted and reformed like the boundaries of his empire, like the allegiances of his subjects, like the very nature of permanence itself. He understood now that the gardens were both triumph and burden, like his empire, like all human attempts to impose order on the natural world. The beauty was undeniable, the achievement magnificent, but the cost was constant vigilance, endless labor, the acceptance that what had been created could be lost as quickly as it had been gained. The gardeners who tended these plants were like the administrators who governed his provinces, working always against the forces of entropy and change. The air carried scents that should not exist together, creating combinations that pleased the senses while defying logic. Alexander breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the impossible perfume of this artificial paradise, understanding that he was experiencing something that would not survive his passing. The gardens required not just water and soil, but the vision that had created them, the will that sustained them, the belief that such beauty was worth the constant effort required to maintain it. As he moved deeper into the gardens, following pathways that curved around planted areas designed to create the illusion of natural landscape, Alexander felt the weight of recognition settling over him. The gardens were a mirror of his own life's work, an attempt to create unity from diversity, to bring together elements that had never naturally coexisted, to build something that would outlast its creator while remaining forever dependent on human care. The terraced levels rose above him, each one representing a different climate, a different vision of paradise, a different dream of what the world might become if human will could overcome natural limitation. The engineering that made it all possible was hidden, like the administrative structures that held his empire together, visible only in its effects, in the impossible beauty that resulted from invisible labor. Water continued to flow around him, through channels and over small waterfalls that caught the moonlight and threw it back in silver cascades. The sound created a symphony of liquid music that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of life itself, with the heartbeat of a world transformed by human ambition. Alexander realized that he was walking through a physical manifestation of his own dreams, a place where the boundaries between possible and impossible had been dissolved through the application of will and vision. The plants around him represented not just botanical specimens, but the living embodiment of connections forged across impossible distances. Each flower had been carried here by travelers who understood that beauty was worth the effort of transportation, that the creation of paradise justified the labor required to sustain it. The gardens were a testament to human determination, to the refusal to accept the limitations imposed by geography and climate. Yet in their artificial perfection, Alexander also recognized the futility that shadowed all human ambition. The gardens would survive only as long as the will to maintain them survived, only as long as the vision that had created them continued to inspire those who came after. They were magnificent and temporary, like his empire, like all attempts to impose human order on the natural world. He knelt beside a small fountain where water bubbled up from hidden springs, its gentle overflow creating rivulets that wound between the roots of flowering shrubs. The water was warm against his fingers, heated by its passage through the sun-baked stones above, carrying with it the dissolved minerals that fed the impossible garden. In the constant circulation of this water, Alexander saw the pulse of life itself, the endless cycle that sustained all growing things, the hidden current that connected every living element in this artificial paradise. The night air moved gently through the garden spaces, stirring leaves that rustled with the soft whisper of wind through foreign foliage. Each breath he took carried the layered fragrances of a dozen different climates, the accumulated perfume of an empire's worth of flowering plants brought together in defiance of natural law. The scents shifted and mingled as the air moved, creating combinations that existed nowhere else in the world, olfactory poems written in the language of impossible beauty. As he walked further along the winding paths, Alexander noticed how the gardeners had arranged the plantings to create the illusion of natural wilderness within the geometric constraints of the terraced structure. Vines cascaded over stone walls in seemingly random profusion, but he could see the careful pruning that guided their growth, the subtle interventions that maintained the balance between wild beauty and controlled design. Every element that appeared natural was actually the result of constant human attention, of decisions made daily about what should grow and what should be removed. The water's constant murmur seemed to deepen as the night progressed, as if the garden itself was settling into sleep while maintaining its eternal circulation of life-giving moisture. Alexander found himself moving more slowly, his steps matching the peaceful rhythm of the flowing water, his breathing synchronized with the gentle pulse of the artificial springs that fed this impossible paradise. In a small alcove where climbing roses formed a natural canopy overhead, he discovered a stone bench worn smooth by countless visitors who had come here to contemplate the marriage of human ambition and natural beauty. The roses above him were varieties he had seen in distant lands, their blooms now thriving in soil that had never known their seeds before his armies had carried them across the known world. Their fragrance filled the enclosed space, creating an atmosphere of concentrated beauty that seemed to exist outside of time. Sitting in this fragrant shelter, Alexander understood that the gardens taught the same lesson as every great human achievement, that beauty could be created through will and sustained through care, but never permanently, never without the constant renewal of the vision that had brought it into being. The water would continue to flow as long as the channels were maintained. The plants would flourish as long as the gardeners tended them. The paradise would endure as long as someone believed it was worth preserving. The realization brought him a profound peace, the same acceptance he had found in studying his maps and listening to his physician's confessions. The gardens were not a failure because they required constant care, but a triumph precisely because human hands had chosen to provide that care. The temporary nature of all human achievement did not diminish its value, but rather made each moment of created beauty more precious, more worthy of contemplation and gratitude. As he stood in the deepest part of the gardens, surrounded by the impossible beauty that human hands had created and human care sustained, Alexander felt a profound peace settle over him. The gardens taught the same lesson as his maps, as his physician's confession, as the Persian carpet that now lay in his chamber, that human achievement was both magnificent and temporary, that the attempt to transcend natural limits was both noble and doomed, that beauty could be created and preserved, but never permanently, never without cost. The water continued its eternal circulation, carrying life to plants that should not exist, sustaining beauty that defied natural law, creating paradise through the marriage of vision and labor, dream and reality, ambition and acceptance. In its gentle, constant murmur, Alexander heard the sound of human hope made audible. the liquid music of dreams transformed into reality through the patient application of skill and care. The bronze mirror waited in the corner of his chamber like an old friend who had traveled with him from Macedonia to the ends of the earth. Alexander approached it slowly, his bare feet silent on the cool stone floor, each step deliberate and measured. The oil lamps flickered gently around the room, their flames dancing in small, hypnotic circles that cast shifting patterns of light and shadow across the polished bronze surface. He stood before the mirror and saw a stranger looking back at him. The face that emerged from the bronze was weathered and worn, marked by years of foreign suns and desert winds. This was not the golden-haired youth who had crossed the Hellespont 13 years ago, burning with dreams of glory and conquest. The man in the mirror carried the geography of his travels written across his features, deep lines etched by the harsh light of Egyptian deserts, skin darkened by Indian monsoons, eyes that held the memory of standing at the edge of the known world. He raised his hand to touch his cheek, and the reflection did the same, the gesture synchronized and strange. His fingers traced the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a gift from a Persian blade at Granicus. He remembered how proud he had been of that first battle wound, how he had refused to let the physicians stitch it too carefully, wanting to wear his courage on his face for all to see. Now it was just one mark among many, a single thread in the tapestry of violence that had become his life. The lamp flames guttered slightly, and for a moment the reflection wavered, becoming something else entirely. He saw himself as he had been at 16, standing before a similar mirror in his father's palace at Pella, practicing the expressions he thought a king should wear. That boy had spent hours perfecting his gaze, trying to capture the look of command he had seen in Philip's eyes. He had practiced speeches to invisible armies, gestures of magnanimity, to conquered enemies who existed only in his imagination. How earnest that boy had been, how certain that greatness was simply a matter of will and courage. Alexander smiled at the memory, and the man in the bronze smiled back, the expression transforming his weathered features into something almost tender. That boy could never have imagined the weight of actual kingship, the way it would settle into his bones like a fever that never quite broke. He could never have foreseen the loneliness of standing above all other men, the terrible isolation of being the one to whom everyone looked for answers. The flames steadied, and his reflections solidified again. He studied the eyes that looked back at him, noting how they had changed. They were still the same pale blue that his mother Olympias had called the color of winter sky. But they held depths now that the boy's eyes had lacked. These eyes had seen the pyramids rise from Egyptian sands, had watched the Ganges flow toward the sea, had looked upon the faces of men from 100 different tribes as they knelt in surrender or stood in defiance. He thought of all the mirrors he had encountered in his travels, each one showing him a slightly different version of himself. The polished silver mirrors of Persian palaces, where he had first seen himself dressed in the robes of the great king, struggling to recognize the Macedonian prince beneath the foreign silk. The still pools of mountain lakes, where he had glimpsed his reflection while crossing the Hindu Kush, his face gaunt with hunger and determination. The ceremonial mirrors in Indian temples, their surfaces clouded with incense smoke, showing him fragments of himself, like pieces of a puzzle he was still trying to solve. Each reflection had been a moment of reckoning, a chance to measure the distance between who he had been and who he was becoming. He had watched his face change with each campaign, each victory and defeat leaving its mark. The soft curves of youth had been carved away by hardship and responsibility, leaving behind something harder, but perhaps more honest. The bronze grew warm under his gaze, heated by the lamp flames and his own breath. He leaned closer, studying the details of his transformation. His hair, once the bright gold that had earned him comparisons to Achilles, was now darker, streaked with premature silver at the temples. The fevers and strange illnesses of foreign lands had taken their toll, leaving him thinner than he had ever been, his cheekbones sharp beneath skin that seemed almost translucent in the lamplight. But it was not decay he saw in the mirror, not the ruin that others whispered about when they thought he could not hear. Instead, he saw refinement, the way a blade becomes sharper through use, the way gold becomes purer when passed through fire. Every line on his face told a story of choice and consequence, of moments when he had chosen to push forward rather than turn back, to risk everything rather than accept the safety of what was known. He remembered the first time he had seen his father's reflection superimposed over his own, the moment when he realized he was becoming the man Philip had always intended him to be. It had been in a mirror in the palace at Babylon, just after he had taken the city for the first time. He had been trying on the crown of the Persian kings, feeling its weight settle onto his brow, when suddenly Philip's ghost seemed to look back at him from the bronze, the same determined set to the jaw, the same calculating intelligence in the eyes, the same willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of a dream that might be madness. But now, looking at his reflection in the quiet hours before dawn, he saw something his father had never achieved. Where Philip's ambitions had been bounded by the familiar world of Greek city-states and barbarian tribes, Alexander had pushed beyond all boundaries, had made the impossible seem inevitable. The face in the mirror belonged to a man who had stood where no Greek had ever stood, who had seen sights that existed only in the stories of poets and the dreams of madmen. The oil in one of the lamps began to run low, and the flame flickered more urgently, casting dancing shadows across the mirror's surface. In those shifting patterns of light and darkness, Alexander saw all the faces he had worn over the years. The grieving son at his father's funeral, the avenging prince crossing into Asia, the pharaoh crowned in Memphis, the student of philosophy in captured Athens, the bridegroom taking Persian wives, the god-king demanding prostration from his own generals. Each face had been real, each role genuinely inhabited, but now they seemed like masks he had worn for the benefit of others. The man in the mirror was something simpler and more complex than any of those personas. He was Alexander, complete and whole, carrying within himself all the contradictions and complexities that had driven him across the known world and beyond. The lamp flame steadied again, and his reflection became clear and still. He saw that his eyes held no regret, only a quiet amazement at the journey that had brought him from that boy's dreams to this man's reality. Every choice had led to this moment. Every victory and defeat had been necessary to create the person who now stood before the bronze mirror in a Babylonian palace, looking at himself with the clear gaze of someone who had finally learned to see. He thought of all the mornings he had awakened in strange beds in conquered cities, reaching automatically for a mirror to remind himself who he was, to anchor himself in his own identity when everything else around him was foreign and new. Now, in what might be his last such morning, he needed no reminder. The face in the bronze was his own, marked by time and experience, but unmistakably his. carrying within it all the dreams of the boy and all the wisdom of the man. The mirror reflected not just his physical form, but the accumulation of all his choices, the weight of every decision that had brought him to this moment. He could see in his own eyes the acceptance of what he had become, the peace that came from recognizing that the journey itself had been the destination, that the boy's dreams had been fulfilled, not in spite of the man's struggles, but because of them. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, touching the edges of the bronze mirror with pale gold, Alexander stepped back from his reflection. The face that looked back at him was serene, marked by experience, but untroubled by doubt. He had seen himself clearly, perhaps for the first time, and found that he was exactly who he was meant to be. The silver cup rests in Alexander's lap, its weight somehow greater than the crown had ever been. He sits motionless by the tall window, watching the Euphrates flow past in the dying light, its surface catching fragments of gold and amber that dance and disappear. The room has grown dim around him, shadows lengthening across the Persian carpets like old friends settling in for the evening. His breathing has become something he notices now, each breath a small effort that requires attention. The correspondence from the provinces lies forgotten on the low table beside him, sealed scrolls that once would have demanded immediate action, now seeming as distant as childhood memories. Instead, he finds himself thinking of his mother's letters, how she always wrote of the weather in Pella, of small domestic concerns that once seemed trivial. The jasmine scent drifts up from the gardens below, mingling with the evening air that carries the sound of temple bells marking the hour with slow, measured tones. He understands now that Olympius was teaching him about the weight of ordinary moments, about how life accumulates not in grand gestures, but in the simple act of noticing the temperature of air against skin, the way light moves across familiar surfaces. The cup feels heavier in his hands than his sword ever did. This small vessel filled with water that tastes faintly of mint has become more precious than all the treasures of Persepolis. He lifts it to his lips, feeling the cool metal against his mouth, tasting the sweetness that seems to contain something essential he had never noticed before. Through the silk curtains, he can see servants moving quietly in the corridors, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets. They glance toward his chamber with concern, but he feels no urgency to reassure them. The empire continues its vast breathing around him, messengers arriving and departing, scribes copying orders, generals consulting maps, but all of it seems to happen at a great distance, as if he were watching it from across a wide river. He thinks of the morning when he first saw Babylon rising from the desert, its walls seeming to touch the sky, its gardens spilling green abundance into the harsh landscape. The city had felt like a promise then, like the final piece of a puzzle that would make sense of all his wandering. Now he understands that the puzzle was never meant to be completed, that the searching itself was the point. The Euphrates continues its ancient conversation with the banks, a sound so constant it has become like silence. Alexander closes his eyes and lets that sound fill him, feeling his own pulse slow to match the river's rhythm. His body, which has carried him across 3 continents, through desert and mountain, through victory and loss, settles deeper into the cushions like a ship finally reaching harbor. Memories drift through his consciousness like the river's current, carrying fragments of faces and voices from across the years. Aristotle's patient explanations of natural philosophy in the gardens of Mieza, where the old philosopher would pause in his discourse to point out the intricate architecture of a flower or the purposeful movement of ants across a stone path. Those lessons had seemed abstract then, philosophical exercises divorced from the practical business of kingship. Now Alexander recognizes them as the most practical wisdom he ever received, instructions in the art of paying attention to the world as it actually is, rather than as he wished it to be. The water in his cup has grown warm from the heat of his hands, but he continues to hold it, finding comfort in its solid presence. Outside his window, the first stars begin to appear in the deepening sky, their light reflecting in the river's surface like scattered coins. He remembers nights spent sleeping under such stars, wrapped in a simple cloak on the hard ground, his men arranged in circles around dying campfires. Those had been the happiest times, he realizes now, when the vast machinery of empire reduced itself to the basic elements of companionship and shared purpose. A night bird calls from somewhere in the palace gardens, its voice liquid and mysterious in the gathering darkness. The sound carries him back to another evening, years ago, when he and Hephaestion had walked the battlements of a captured city whose name he can no longer recall. They had spoken little that night, content to move in comfortable silence through the cooling air. But Alexander remembers the profound sense of completion he had felt, as if all his striving had led to that simple moment of shared quiet. The fever that has plagued him for days seems to ebb and flow like a tide, bringing periods of clarity alternating with waves of exhaustion that leave him feeling as though he were dissolving into the evening air. During these clear intervals, he finds his mind working with unusual precision, seeing connections and patterns that had previously eluded him. The empire, he understands now, was never really his to possess. It was a living thing that had used him as much as he had shaped it, a vast organism that would continue its own evolution long after he was gone. The servants have lit oil lamps in the corridor outside his chamber, their warm glow creating dancing patterns on the walls that remind him of the cave paintings he had seen in the mountains beyond Sogdiana. Those ancient artists had worked by firelight to record their understanding of the world, leaving images of animals and hunters that spoke across centuries about the eternal human desire to make sense of existence through art. He wonders what images future artists will create to capture his own story, whether they will understand that his greatest discoveries had nothing to do with conquest. When he opens his eyes again, the last light has faded from the water, leaving only the reflection of stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The cup in his hands catches this starlight, transforming it into something that seems to pulse with its own gentle radiance. He realizes that this moment, sitting quietly by the window with water and starlight, contains everything he had been seeking in all his conquests. The room breathes around him, expanding and contracting with his own breath, and he understands that his greatest victory may be this: learning to be still, learning to let the world come to him instead of always moving toward it. In this stillness, he finds a peace that no battlefield ever offered, a completeness that no crown could provide. The silver cup grows warm in his hands, and Alexander closes his eyes again, letting the sound of the river carry him toward whatever comes next, no longer a conqueror, but simply a man learning to rest in the gentle embrace of an ending that feels, surprisingly, like coming home. The Euphrates continues its eternal journey toward the sea, carrying with it the accumulated wisdom of all the civilizations that have risen and fallen along its banks. And Alexander allows himself to become part of that ancient flow, his own story joining the countless others that the river has witnessed and will continue to witness long after his name becomes just another whisper in the wind. The moonlight transforms the courtyard into something ethereal, each marble column casting long shadows that seem to move independently of their source. Alexander moves between them like a sleepwalker, his bare feet silent on the cool stone, pausing at irregular intervals as if listening to voices only he can hear. He stops before a particular pillar, one that catches the light differently from the others and speaks a name into the night air. Hephaestion. The word hangs there like an offering, and Alexander waits, his head tilted slightly as if expecting a response. The night air carries his whispered word away, but something remains, a presence that feels as real as the marble beneath his feet. Continuing his slow procession between the columns, he pauses again, this time before a shadow that seems deeper than the others. Parmenion. The old general's name echoes softly in the enclosed space, and Alexander nods as if acknowledging a greeting. These are not apologies he offers, but recognitions, acknowledgments of how their voices have become part of his own internal council. The guards watch from a distance, understanding that their king walks among companions they cannot see. Their torches flicker in the still air, casting dancing patterns on the walls, but they make no move to approach. This is a conversation that requires solitude, a meeting that can only happen in the space between day and night, between the living and the dead. Clytus. The name comes harder, weighted with memory and regret. But Alexander speaks it clearly into the moonlit air. He remembers the wine-heavy night, the words that could not be taken back, the terrible swiftness of violence that left them both changed forever. But here, in this place between worlds, forgiveness seems possible, understanding seems within reach. Night-blooming flowers release their fragrance into the still air, jasmine and night-blooming cereus, creating an atmosphere thick with sweetness and memory. Somewhere in the distance, a fountain trickles softly, its sound like gentle laughter, like the conversation of old friends who have found each other again after a long separation. Alexander continues his circuit of the columns, each pause bringing another name, another recognition. Philip. His father's presence feels strongest of all, not the Philip who died by an assassin's blade, but the Philip who taught him to read maps by candlelight, who showed him how to gentle a horse with patience rather than force. The marble gleams like ivory in the silver light, and Alexander realizes that this courtyard has become a temple, a place where the boundaries between past and present, between memory and reality, have grown thin enough to cross. He is not alone, has never been alone. The dead continue to counsel and comfort the living, their voices woven so completely into his thoughts that he cannot separate their wisdom from his own. As he moves deeper into the colonnade, the moonlight creates shifting patterns on the floor, transforming the familiar space into something dreamlike and mysterious. Each column becomes a doorway into memory, and Alexander finds himself reliving moments he thought he had forgotten. The morning he first donned armor, feeling the weight of bronze settle across his shoulders like destiny itself. The afternoon Bucephalus first allowed him to approach, the great horse's dark eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed almost human. The fountain's gentle murmur weaves through these memories, providing a constant backdrop that seems to give them substance and weight. Alexander realizes that this sound has been with him throughout his life, the eternal music of water finding its way through stone, patient and persistent, and ultimately victorious over every obstacle. It reminds him of his mother's voice, reading to him from scrolls of poetry when he was too young to understand the words but old enough to be comforted by their rhythm. A cool breeze stirs the silk banners hanging from the upper galleries, their colors muted to shades of gray and silver in the moonlight. The temperature has cooled, bringing relief from the day's heat, and Alexander feels his fever breaking, his mind clearing as if washed by the gentle night air. In this clarity, he sees his life not as a series of conquests, but as a conversation with all those who shaped him, a dialogue that continues even now in this moonlit space. He pauses before another column and speaks a name he has not uttered aloud in years. Aristotle. The old philosopher appears not as the stern teacher who demanded perfect recitation of lessons, but as the man who once spent an entire afternoon showing him how to observe the behavior of bees, teaching him that true knowledge comes from patient attention to the world as it actually is, rather than as we wish it to be. The conversation continues as Alexander moves through the colonnade, each name bringing its own constellation of memories. Antipater, he whispers, remembering the regent's steady counsel during the early years of his reign, the way the older man could cut through political complexity with a few well-chosen words. Craterus, and with that name comes the memory of shared laughter around campfires, of the easy camaraderie that had made even the hardest campaigns bearable. Silk banners hang motionless from the upper galleries, their colors muted to shades of gray and silver in the moonlight. The palace sleeps around him, but Alexander feels more awake than he has in months, his senses heightened by the fever's retreat and the strange intimacy of this nocturnal pilgrimage. He understands now that leadership was never about commanding others, but about carrying their voices within himself, about making decisions in consultation with all those who had contributed to his understanding of the world. The marble beneath his feet holds the coolness of the night, and Alexander finds himself grateful for this simple sensation, for the way it grounds him in the present moment, even as his mind ranges across years and continents. He thinks of all the floors he has walked across, from the wooden planks of Macedonian halls to the intricate mosaics of Persian palaces, and realizes that each step was part of a larger journey toward this moment of recognition and acceptance. He completes his circle of the courtyard and finds himself back where he started. But he is not the same man who began this nocturnal pilgrimage. The conversations with ghosts have reminded him that leadership is ultimately about carrying the voices of others within yourself, about making decisions not in isolation, but in consultation with all those who have shaped you. As he prepares to return to his chamber, Alexander speaks one final name into the night: Mother. Olympias appears not as the ambitious queen who pushed him toward greatness, but as the woman who sang him to sleep with stories of heroes and gods, who taught him that some truths can only be learned through living. Her voice seems to echo in the fountain's gentle murmur, reminding him that love and ambition are not opposites, but different expressions of the same fierce desire to matter, to leave something lasting in the world. The moonlight begins to fade as clouds drift across the sky, but the presence of his companions remains strong. Alexander understands now that he has never been walking alone, that every step of his journey has been guided by the accumulated wisdom of those who loved him, even when that love was complicated by ambition, politics, and the terrible weight of power. As he moves toward the palace entrance, his footsteps echo softly in the courtyard, but they are not solitary sounds. They are part of a larger rhythm, a conversation between past and present that will continue long after he is gone. In this understanding, he finds a peace he had not expected, a sense of completion that comes not from conquest, but from recognition, from finally hearing clearly the voices that have always been there, waiting patiently for him to listen. The fountain continues its eternal song, and Alexander carries that music with him as he returns to his chamber, no longer a king walking alone, but a man accompanied by all those who have shaped him into who he has become. The olive tree's ancient bark presses against Alexander's back, its rough texture familiar and comforting, as if he has always belonged in this exact spot. He has positioned himself cross-legged at the base of the tree as the first light begins to touch the eastern horizon, watching the garden emerge from darkness in stages, like a painting being revealed one brushstroke at a time. First, the tallest palms catch the light, their fronds rustling gently in the morning breeze. Then the flowering bushes begin to glow with soft color, and finally, the small herbs at his feet seem to emerge from shadow like gifts being offered to the new day. Each plant appears to have its own moment of awakening, its own way of greeting the sun, and Alexander finds himself holding his breath as he witnesses this daily miracle he has somehow never noticed before. Dew clings to leaves and petals, creating tiny prisms that catch and scatter the strengthening light into fragments of rainbow. The air is cool and sweet, carrying the mingled scents of roses, mint, and wet earth, a combination that seems to contain the essence of life itself. His illness has not left him, but it no longer feels like an enemy. Instead, it has become a teacher, showing him how to pay attention to each moment, how to find the extraordinary within the ordinary. A small lizard emerges from beneath a stone and regards him solemnly, its dark eyes reflecting the growing light. Alexander nods to it, as he might to a fellow philosopher, recognizing in its stillness a wisdom he is only beginning to understand. The creature blinks once, slowly, then disappears back into the shadows, leaving Alexander with the sense that he has been blessed by this brief encounter. Birds begin their morning songs one by one, creating a symphony that builds gradually from single notes to complex harmonies. A dove calls from somewhere in the palm trees, its voice liquid and pure, and Alexander feels something inside his chest loosen, a tension he had carried for so long he had forgotten it was there. The fountain in the garden's center begins to catch and reflect the growing light, its water singing a gentle song that mingles with the bird calls and the whisper of wind through leaves. Somewhere nearby, gardeners begin their quiet work, their movements respectful of the early hour, their tools scraping softly against earth and stone. Alexander breathes deeply, feeling the morning air fill his lungs completely for the first time in days. The fever that has plagued him seems to have lifted with the dawn, leaving him weak but strangely clear, as if his vision has been washed clean. He understands now that his body's failing has been teaching him something essential about the nature of existence, about the beauty that can only be seen when we stop trying to control everything around us. The olive tree above him is ancient, its trunk gnarled and twisted by centuries of growth, its branches reaching in all directions as if embracing the sky. Alexander runs his palm along its bark, feeling the deep grooves carved by time and weather, understanding that this tree has witnessed the rise and fall of countless rulers, has provided shade for philosophers and farmers alike, has remained constant while empires crumbled around it. In its patient endurance, he finds a model for a different kind of greatness, one measured not in conquests, but in the simple act of continuing to grow, to provide shelter, to bear fruit season after season. A butterfly lands on his outstretched hand, its wings like stained glass in the morning light. Alexander remains perfectly still, afraid to disturb this moment of grace, watching as the creature rests trustingly on his palm. Its wings pulse gently with life, and he feels connected to something vast and ancient, to the cycle of growth and decay that governs all things. The light continues to strengthen, revealing more details of the garden's beauty. The intricate patterns of bark on the date palms, the delicate architecture of spider webs jeweled with dew, the way shadows and light create constantly shifting patterns on the ground. Alexander realizes that this garden contains everything he has been searching for in all his conquests: beauty, truth, the sense of being part of something larger than himself. As the sun climbs higher, more creatures begin to stir in the garden's depths. A cat emerges from beneath a rose bush, stretches luxuriously in a patch of sunlight, then settles down to begin its morning grooming with the methodical precision of a ritual. Bees begin their work among the flowers, their humming creating a bass note beneath the higher melodies of the songbirds. Alexander watches this awakening world with the fascination of someone seeing it for the first time, understanding that he has spent so many years focused on distant horizons that he has missed the miracles occurring at his feet. The gardeners move closer, their presence announced by the soft scrape of tools against earth and the gentle splash of water being poured from clay vessels. They work with the unhurried efficiency of those who understand that gardens cannot be rushed, that growth follows its own rhythm regardless of human impatience. Alexander recognizes in their movements the same patient wisdom he has seen in the olive tree, the understanding that true cultivation requires not force, but attention, not conquest, but cooperation with natural processes. His father's ring catches the light as he shifts position slightly, and he thinks of Philip not as the king who was murdered, but as the man who taught him to notice the small things, who showed him that true power comes from understanding one's place in the natural order. The ring feels lighter now, not a burden, but a connection to all those who came before and all those who will come after. A breeze stirs the leaves above him, creating a sound like gentle applause, and Alexander realizes that the garden is celebrating something, perhaps the simple fact of his presence, his willingness to finally be still and receive what it has always been offering. The morning air carries the scent of bread baking in the palace kitchens, reminding him of the simple human needs that continue regardless of political upheaval, the eternal cycle of hunger and satisfaction that connects him to every person who has ever lived. As the sun climbs higher, the garden fully awakens around him, alive with movement and sound, and the sweet fragrance of growing things. Alexander closes his eyes and lets himself become part of this awakening, feeling his own pulse slow to match the garden's rhythm, his breathing deepen to echo the earth's ancient breathing. When he opens his eyes again, the world seems transformed, not by conquest or ambition, but by acceptance. by the simple act of allowing himself to be present in this moment without trying to change or control it. He understands now that his greatest victory is not the empire he has built, but this: learning to be still, learning to receive the world's gifts with gratitude rather than always demanding more. The butterfly lifts from his hand and disappears into the flowering bushes, but its blessing remains. Alexander sits quietly beneath the olive tree, no longer a conqueror, but simply a man who has finally learned to see, finding in this garden at dawn all the treasure he had ever needed, all the kingdom he had ever truly sought. The fountain continues its eternal song, the birds their morning chorus, and Alexander allows himself to become part of this ancient music, his own breathing and heartbeat joining the garden's symphony of life, continuing, growing, enduring through all the changes that time brings. Alexander lies among the silk cushions, his body finally at rest, the fever broken and leaving him weak but strangely clear, as if a veil has been lifted from his vision. He turns his father's ring slowly around his finger, feeling its familiar weight, the gold warm from his skin, connecting him across time to the man who first placed it there, and to the boy he once was in Pella. Through the gauze curtains, he can see his generals waiting in the antechamber, their voices low and urgent as they discuss the succession, the future of the empire, the 1,000 practical matters that death makes necessary. But their urgency no longer touches him. He understands now that the empire will continue or it will not, and either outcome is acceptable. What matters is this moment, this breath, this small circle of gold that contains an entire history. The young food taster, Kleitos, sits quietly in the corner, no longer needed, but unwilling to leave. Alexander finds comfort in his presence, in this simple loyalty that asks for nothing in return. The boy's eyes are red from crying. He thinks no one has noticed, but Alexander sees everything now with a clarity that surprises him. He wants to tell Kleitos that death is not the enemy they thought it was, that it is simply another country, another territory to explore. Soft morning light filters through layers of silk, creating a dreamlike atmosphere in the chamber where everything seems to glow with gentle golden radiance. The air is warm but not oppressive, stirred gently by fans wielded by silent servants who move like dancers, their movements so practiced they have become a form of prayer. Incense burns somewhere nearby, its smoke rising in lazy spirals that remind Alexander of the signal fires that once carried messages across his empire, connecting distant outposts to the center, ensuring that no part of his domain felt isolated or forgotten. Now he realizes that he was never the center, that the true connections were always between the people themselves, the bonds of family and friendship and shared purpose that needed no emperor to maintain them. The sounds of the palace seem muffled and far away. Footsteps in distant corridors, the rustle of fabric as servants go about their duties, the low murmur of voices discussing matters that once would have required his immediate attention. All of it continues without him, the great machine of empire running on the momentum he helped create, but no longer requiring his constant guidance. Alexander closes his eyes and feels the ring's weight on his finger, remembering the day Philip placed it there. The ceremony that seemed so important then, the sense that he was inheriting not just a kingdom, but a destiny. Now he understands that the true inheritance was simpler, the capacity to love, to lead with compassion, to recognize the humanity in both friend and enemy. Kleitos shifts in his chair, and Alexander opens his eyes, to look at the young man who has served him so faithfully. "Come here," he whispers, his voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the hushed chamber. The boy approaches hesitantly, and Alexander takes his hand, feeling the calluses from kitchen work, the warmth of young skin, the trembling that speaks of devotion and grief. "You have been a good friend," Alexander tells him, and sees the boy's eyes fill with fresh tears. "Remember that friendship is the only conquest that matters, the only victory that endures." Cleitos nods, unable to speak, but his grip on Alexander's hand tightens, and in that pressure Alexander feels all the love he has known, all the connections that have made his life meaningful. The ring catches the light as Alexander lifts their joined hands, and he thinks of all the hands this circle of gold has touched, his father's, his own, and now this young man's whose loyalty has asked for nothing but the chance to serve. It occurs to him that this is how kingdoms really pass from one generation to the next, not through grand ceremonies, but through small gestures of trust and affection. Outside, he can hear the city of Babylon beginning its daily life, merchants calling their wares, children playing in the streets, the eternal rhythm of human activity that will continue long after all the kings and conquerors are forgotten. This sound, which once frustrated him with its indifference to his grand plans, now comforts him. The world will go on, people will love and work and dream, and that is enough. Alexander releases Cleitos's hand and settles deeper into the cushions, feeling his body sink into their softness like a ship finally reaching harbor after a long voyage. The empire stretches around him, vast and complex, but he no longer feels the weight of holding it all together. It has its own life now, its own momentum, and he can finally let go. The morning light grows stronger, filling the chamber with golden warmth, and he finds himself thinking of all the mornings he has witnessed across the known world. Dawn breaking over the Hellespont as his army crossed into Asia, the first glimpse of the Indus Valley bathed in rose-colored light, the way the sun struck the pyramids of Egypt and made them seem like monuments to eternity itself. Each sunrise had been a promise of new territories to explore, new peoples to encounter, new understandings to achieve. But this morning feels different, final in a way that brings not sadness, but a profound sense of completion. He has seen enough sunrises, fought enough battles, loved enough friends to understand what it all meant. The great campaign of his life is ending not in defeat, but in the deepest victory of all, the recognition that he has been part of something infinitely larger than himself. The silk curtains stir gently in the warm breeze that carries the scents of the palace gardens, jasmine and rose, cedar and myrrh, the mingled fragrances of a dozen conquered lands now growing together in peaceful harmony. This blending of essences seems to Alexander a perfect metaphor for what his empire had truly accomplished. Not the imposition of one culture upon many, but the creation of spaces where different ways of being could flourish side by side. He remembers walking through those gardens with Hephaestion in the early days of their occupation of Babylon, both of them marveling at how the Persian gardeners had created beauty from the harsh landscape of Mesopotamia. They had spoken then of building similar gardens in every city of the empire, places where soldiers could rest and remember the gentler aspects of life. Some of those gardens had been planted, Alexander knows, and they will outlast all the monuments to his military victories. The thought of Hephaestion brings a familiar ache, but it is softer now, more like the pleasant melancholy of remembering a perfect day from childhood than the sharp grief that had consumed him after his friend's death. He can almost feel Hephaestion's presence in the chamber, not as a ghost, but as a living part of his own consciousness, the way loved friends become part of us and travel with us always. Kleitos has returned to his chair but remains watchful, ready to respond to any need. Alexander appreciates this quiet vigilance, this refusal to abandon his post even when that post has become largely ceremonial. It reminds him of the loyalty he has inspired throughout his life, not through fear or reward, but through the simple recognition of shared humanity. This young man will carry something of Alexander forward into whatever comes next, not the memory of a conqueror, but the experience of being truly seen and valued. The incense continues to rise in delicate spirals, and Alexander follows its path with his eyes until it disappears into the shadows near the ceiling. Somewhere in that smoky ascent, he sees a metaphor for his own approaching transformation, the way consciousness might rise and disperse into something larger and less defined, but no less real. The thought brings him peace rather than fear. He has always been curious about what lies beyond the next horizon, and death is simply the ultimate frontier. The distant sounds of the city continue their gentle murmur, and Alexander realizes he is listening to the sound of his own legacy, not the grand monuments or the written histories, but the simple fact of people going about their lives in cities he helped to build, speaking languages he helped to spread, carrying forward the 1,000 small innovations and connections that arise when different cultures meet in peace rather than war. He closes his eyes one final time, his father's ring still on his finger, still connecting him to the long chain of human love and loss that gives meaning to all our brief conquests. In this letting go, he finds the peace that no victory ever brought him, the understanding that his true legacy lies not in the lands he conquered but in the love he shared, the simple recognition that to be fully human is conquest enough, that to rest at last in the embrace of acceptance is the final, most beautiful victory of all. The afternoon light had changed, becoming something Alexander had never seen before, not in all his travels across the known world. It seemed to come from within the marble walls themselves, as though the stone had been waiting all these years to reveal its secret luminescence. The Euphrates outside his window had grown louder, or perhaps his hearing had become more acute, more attuned to the eternal conversation between water and stone, between time and the things that endure. He lay perfectly still now, his breathing so gentle it seemed to match the rhythm of the river itself. The fever had not broken, but it no longer mattered. Something else was happening, something that had nothing to do with illness or recovery. His consciousness was expanding, flowing beyond the boundaries of his body like water finding its natural course. The faces came to him then, not as memories, but as presences. His mother Olympias, fierce and protective, her eyes holding all the mysteries of the oracle at Delphi. She had always told him he was destined for greatness, but now he understood she had meant something different than conquest. Greatness, he saw now, was not in the taking, but in the giving, not in the holding, but in the releasing. Philip appeared beside her, his father's weathered face softened by something Alexander had rarely seen in life, approval without condition. The old king nodded slowly, and Alexander felt a weight he had carried since childhood finally lift from his shoulders. He had spent so many years trying to surpass his father's legacy, never understanding that the true inheritance was not in outdoing, but in completing, in bringing the story full circle. Hephaestion's laugh echoed through the chamber, warm and familiar as summer rain. His beloved friend stood at the foot of the bed, young again, unmarked by the fever that had taken him. Their eyes met, and Alexander felt the last knot of grief in his chest dissolve. Death, he realized, was not separation, but reunion, not ending, but transformation into something larger and more enduring. The ring slipped from his finger then, the great seal of Macedonia falling silently to the silk cushions. He watched it go without concern. What need did he have now for symbols of earthly power? The true kingdom he had been seeking all his life was opening before him, vast and welcoming as the sky above Babylon. The walls of the chamber seemed to dissolve, replaced by endless vistas he recognized from dreams. The Hindu Kush mountains rose in purple majesty, their peaks touching clouds that had witnessed the birth of civilizations. The Ganges flowed silver in moonlight, carrying prayers and offerings toward some distant sacred sea. Alexandria's lighthouse sent its beam across waters that connected all shores, all peoples, all stories into one great narrative of human longing and achievement. He could hear his soldiers singing around their campfires, their voices carrying across decades and continents, Macedonians and Persians, Greeks and Indians, all united in the fellowship of shared purpose. They had not conquered the world after all, but had been conquered by it, transformed by contact with its infinite diversity and beauty. The true victory was not in the subduing, but in the understanding, not in the ruling, but in the serving. Bucephalus whinnied softly in the distance, his great war horse waiting patiently as he always had. Alexander smiled, remembering the day he had first mounted the black stallion, how they had learned to trust each other completely. That trust, he saw now, had been practiced for this moment, this ultimate act of faith in something larger than himself. The Euphrates called his name then, not urgently, but with the patience of something eternal. The river had seen the rise and fall of Babylon, had carried the prayers of Nebuchadnezzar and the dreams of Hammurabi. It would outlast all human ambitions, all earthly kingdoms, flowing on toward the sea that receives all waters and asks no questions. Alexander felt himself beginning to flow with it, his consciousness merging with the great current that connected all things. He was no longer Alexander of Macedon, conqueror of the known world. He was something simpler and more profound, a drop of water returning to the ocean, a breath of wind rejoining the eternal atmosphere, a story finding its place in the larger narrative that had no beginning and would have no end. The golden light intensified, filling every corner of the chamber until there were no shadows left, no dark places where fear or regret could hide. He could see now that every battle he had fought, every city he had founded, every friend he had loved and lost had been leading to this moment of perfect understanding. He had not been conquering the world, but learning from it, not imposing his will upon it, but discovering his place within its infinite wisdom. His breathing grew softer still, barely disturbing the warm air that seemed to shimmer with invisible threads of connection. The faces of all those he had known and loved surrounded him now, not as ghosts or memories, but as living presences, part of the eternal community of souls that death could not divide. They were welcoming him home, not to some distant paradise, but to the place he had always belonged, the source from which all journeys begin, and to which all travelers must eventually return. The sound of the Euphrates filled the chamber completely now, its ancient song washing away the last vestiges of pain and ambition and regret. Alexander closed his eyes and let himself be carried by that music, that flow, that endless conversation between the temporary and the eternal. He had found his way home at last, not to Macedonia or Egypt or any earthly kingdom, but to the place beyond all boundaries, where all waters meet and all stories become one. In the growing silence, he found himself remembering not the great battles or the moments of triumph, but the quiet interludes between campaigns, evenings spent with his companions around fires that burned bright against the vast darkness of unknown territories, the way Hephaestion would lean against his shoulder as they planned the next day's march, the comfortable weight of friendship that needed no words, the laughter of his soldiers as they shared stories from their homelands, each tale adding another thread to the tapestry of understanding they were weaving together. These memories felt more real now than the marble walls around him, more substantial than the empire that bore his name. They were the true conquests, the lasting victories that death could not diminish. Every moment of genuine connection, every instance of compassion shown to a defeated enemy, every act of mercy that had chosen understanding over vengeance, these were the treasures he would carry forward into whatever came next. The afternoon light continued its slow transformation, becoming something that seemed to emanate from within his own consciousness rather than from any external source. He understood now that this inner radiance had always been there, waiting to be discovered. All his campaigns across the known world had been, in essence, a journey toward this recognition, that the kingdom he had been seeking was not a place on any map, but a state of being, a way of existing in perfect harmony with the flow of life itself. The river's voice grew gentler still, no longer calling but simply welcoming, like a mother's lullaby that promises rest after a long day of play. Alexander felt his body settling deeper into the silk cushions, each muscle releasing its hold on the tensions that had driven him across continents. The great campaign was ending not in defeat, but in the deepest victory of all, the recognition that he had always been exactly where he needed to be, that every step of his journey had been leading him home to this moment of perfect peace. And in that perfect silence, in that complete surrender to the mystery that embraces all things, Alexander the Great became something even greater than he had ever dreamed. A part of the eternal story that flows on forever, carrying the dreams and loves and longings of all who have lived and all who are yet to be born toward that distant sea where all questions find their answers and all journeys find their rest. Join us for more quiet moments from history where literary storytelling meets peaceful sleep. Subscribe for stories that honor both the art of narrative and the gift of rest.